Sometimes when you study Baptist history, you talk about Western civilization, and we talk about the history of the world. Now, the Catholic Church became a very powerful entity when they came to America because they discovered gold and they stole gold. They wanted to find Ponce de Leon, remember, he wanted to find the fountain of youth. Mm-hmm. How you could have eternal life by drinking from this fountain of youth. Well, the people were very superstitious at that time, and they thought they could find a fountain of youth where they drank the water and they'd live forever. And they could sell this water, merchandise this water, all over the world, and make tons of money for the Catholic Church in Spain. Well, in 1545, they discovered, in the nation of Bolivia, they discovered Mount Potosi, which was a mountain of silver. And remember now, we talked about some world, what's going on in the world. How did Spain have so much power and money to come in and basically enslave all of California under Spanish rule through the Catholic Church, and enslave millions of Indians, millions, decimate completely, almost decimated Indian populations, completely killed them all. Now down Mountain Potosi was a different thing down there. And Mount Potosi, here not too many years ago, they found a mass grave of 400 Indian slaves. Oh. This was one burial, a mass grave of 400 Indian slaves. Oh. It is estimated there at Mount Potosi, over the period of that mountain of silver, from 1545 onward, the Catholic Church in Spain worked to death up to 8 million Indians. They worked to death up to 8 million Indians and some black slaves that they had taken there. Now, why did this all take place? How did it happen? Spain has very little resources in Spain. But when Queen Isabella, they had Columbus come over here, they discovered America, then we had the Columbia Exchange, they brought disease to America and took all the foods of America and fed all of Europe, and even China. Now China, by 1400, had an armada. They had a Chinese armada of 319 ships, I believe it was. And the ships were so much larger than anything in Europe. They would go from continent to continent and they'd look, and the people would be so afraid because they thought a continent had arrived. The ships were so many it looked like a continent coming at them. But there was nothing there they wanted. They had food, they had everything in China. The only thing that China really needed was precious metals. Now China was blessed by the yams they found in America. They used a lot of yams, they used potatoes, they used different things that they had taken from America to all the different continents of Europe and Asia that were developed by the Native Americans here. The Native Americans were not ignorant savages. You go down into the Amazon jungles and everything else, you find out what was left of the American Indians from the great civilization that were driven by the Catholic Church into the wildernesses. And these were the remnants. They were at one time pyramid builders, they were one time doctors, they were one time lawyers, they had postal service, and all the way down to Central and South America. They had great civilizations down there, and civilizations where people were never hungry. They had plenty of food. When Spain came over there, they looked at this and they said, this is unbelievable, but look at how clean the streets are. They had big cities. They had pyramids, they had mummies, they had all the things that Egypt had. And then they began to conquer and destroy and decimate with disease and with literally bullets and the sword. murdered, enslaved, worked to death. In Mount Potosi alone, up to 8 million Indians were worked to death in those mines. Now China, like I said, needed gold and silver. So they would trade, and they began to trade with the world, and they even traded technology. You know that the flush toilet was invented in China. That the gas in pipes, natural gas put into it, natural gas stoves, was invented in China. Cast iron stoves, etc., was invented in China. You could go in China from one district, one state in China, from one state to the other, and you could take a printed script. And if you sold everything in your house in one province of China, and you moved over for 1,000 miles away, you could take that script and buy another house exactly like the one that you sold for exactly the same amount of money. And what China needed was the backing for that money. They wanted to print money. They had printed money. They had printed a printing press. Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press. China did. Now, all of this taking place over here, China began to trade with Spain, and they started selling whatever they had for gold and silver. And like I said in the last class, during this period of time, this is where you have the Spanish Armada. And then after Queen Elizabeth comes on the scene, she lines up with Sir Francis Drake, a pirate, and they go out and they start rampaging and sinking or taking over Spanish ships, and all the loads of gold and silver, and the American Indians and the people over here are enslaved, and they're dying by the thousands almost every day to gather all of that gold and silver wherever it may be. America, before Columbus, had a population of about 150 million people, and some of the most advanced cities in the world. After Columbus, 100 years later, nearly 100 million people have died of disease and slavery. As the Spanish went back to Europe, and even some of the other nations went back to Europe, they took with them, if they could capture Indian slaves, and they took the Indian slaves over there, and they used them for runners to the coaches. And you have to understand one thing about Spain and France and England and Germany and all this. We have the princes and we have the paupers. If you were in England or in Spain, and you went out in the country, you were a poor man, and you wanted to go hunt a rabbit because your family was starving, you couldn't do that because all of the game, the wild game, in every hill was the king's game. You couldn't do that. You've heard of Robin Hood and all of that. This was all started all back then because the people were starving to death. They looked upon the people of England and Spain as a lesser of the races. If you weren't born in the caste of being a prince, you were a pauper and you were nothing but property. The princes and the paupers. So when they came to America, they treated the American Indians as less than human. Because the workers came over here, and so the American Indian, and of course the black slaves that they were bringing to do some work, because they lasted longer than the Indians, they were expendable. And they were nothing. They had no rights. Now we're getting back here now. We're going to go and jump ahead a little bit. But how did Spain and the Catholic Church fund their exploits into America? How did they? By the silver and gold they stole from this country, and how they enslaved these people. Of course they made converts of these people, but the converts were slaves. They made converts of the Indians along the coastal regions all the way from San Diego to Oregon borders up there. But they were slaves. Slaves. The whole of Mississippi country had come under the dominion of Spain. We're on page 329. The conviction of the settlers was that this country belonged to Great Britain. In April 1782, there was an uprising against Spain in favor of the control of England. Now remember, we got two entities here, and both of them have a king, and we have princes, and we have paupers, don't we? But they thought they could get a little bit better deal from England than they did from Spain. Because Spain, Spanish, the Catholic Church now, we have Catholicism against the Catholic Church. Catholic Church and the Church of England, okay? As the not might have been expected, Spain put down the revolt. The harsh treatment of the French malcontents in New Orleans by Governor O'Reilly was then recalled. Many fled the country, precipitatingly taking with them their families as best they could. Few incidents in the early history of Mississippi caused more suffering or distress than the flight of the men and women of that day. Claiborne gives the following pathetic account of the sufferings of a large number of fugitives. And now remember, the Chickasaw Nation is in Mississippi. That's my family. They're in Tanika Village. These villages in what they called the 5 civilized tribes. You know why they call them 5 civilized tribes? Because they were the ones that's growing with great plantations and great mansions. The Indians had mansions. Okay? Mansions. Now all this land was taken over, and they were driven into Indian territory later on. In the 1800s. All of the plantations and the mansions that the Indians had built were taken over and sold for public auction to white settlers. You were Indian, you couldn't stay there. You had to move. You had to go into another wilderness. And they started to discover gold and coal and silver and oil, and then it was taken away again. A more precipitate and distressing exodus never occurred. Leaving their homes, which they had made comfortable by severe toil, their property, which had been accumulated by patient industry with no transportation but few pack horses and no luggage but their blankets and some scanty stores. They gathered their wives and their children and stuck out into the wilderness. Fearful of pursuit, fearful of ambush, dogged by famine, tortured by thirst, exposed to every vicissitude of weather, weakened by disease, more than decimated by death, the women and the children dying every day. This terrible journey makes the darkest page of our record. But the courage and the perseverance they evinced, the uncomplaining patience, the fortitude of refined, delicate women, the period of suffering and peril, shed a glory of sunshine over the story, and their descendants, still numerous in Mississippi, will read it with mingled pity and admiration. Those who remained were treated better by the Spanish governor than might have been expected. They lived in fear. The successive commandants of Natchez and the governing general of Louisiana were accomplished gentlemen, trained into arms and stately but courteous and punctilious, fond of etiquette and pomp, but hospitality, generous and forbearing. They were Catholics, of course, and such was the religion of the kingdom and of its provinces, and those who immigrated to that country came to full knowledge of that fact. You can only have one religion in this country. The large majority of the settlers were Protestants and enjoyed their faith and the right of private worship. No attempt was made to proselytize or prescribe them, nor was there any official interference unless the parties in their zeal or under indiscreet advisors became offensively demonstrative. In other words, began to evangelize. The language of Claiborne is guarded because he's being watched. It's kind of like Josephus' history. Josephus' history was written for the Roman government. And so he couldn't offend the Roman government. And so you will find many times in Josephus' history of the Jews and the Jewish wars that is as complimenting the Roman government and not castigating it, because he's being paid by them, and if he wanted to stay alive and stay paid, he better make up a little history and cover up some things. The language of Claiborne is guarded and has in it a number of limiting clauses. Little further on, he justifies the action of the Spanish governors by contrasting their action with those of some of the Protestants in New England. So far as Baptists are concerned, the point holds good. They no more escaped the wrath of the Roman Catholic in Mississippi and Louisiana than did the Puritans of New England. The Puritans began to persecute. The Puritans. The Puritans were looked upon as a pure, pearly white people. But they killed people. They persecuted people. Their great admiration for John Calvin. John Calvin killed people. John Calvin was not religiously tolerant. John Calvin believed in the church and the state were one. He believed in forced religion. A man, if he didn't go to church, you could kill him, if need be. If he couldn't convert a man, he would kill him. Simple as that. Under the strictly Catholic dynasty in an age of intolerance, it was under the conditions like these that in the spring of 1780 a number of immigrants left South Carolina for the Natchez country. In this company there was 10 or 12 Baptists. There was Richard Curtis Sr., who was the father of a large family and a deacon, and Richard Curtis Jr., who had a small family and was a licensed preacher. John Courtney, John Stampley, Daniel and William Ogden, Mr. Perkins, friends and neighbors, and Richard Curtis, the preacher, was from Virginia and had settled previously in the War of Independence in the South Carolina on the great Pee River, some 60 miles from Charleston. During the war, the elder Curtis and his sons were soldiers in the commanding general, General Francis Marion. They remained in the service until their homes and their substances were destroyed by the British and the Tories. Now here we have the Church of England. The Church of England, the Catholic Church and the Church of England lined up against the Baptists. And they lined up against America. They said the only godly, biblical way for a country to be ruled is under a sovereign king, not the mass of people, because they don't have any education, they don't have any good sense. God sets up kings, they said, Romans 13, but not democracies and not republics. As exposed as it were to the constant attacks of the enemy, they saw that their only hope was to immigrate to west. After enduring hardships incident to a journey through an unbroken forest, the company reached the Holston River in the year of 1780. Here they halted to make needed preparation for the voyage by water. Now they're going to go in a ship, in a flatboat or whatever. When this had been accomplished, 3 flatboats started down the Holston River. When toward the close of the year, the waters of the Holston River had attained a sufficient depth for navigation, and they embarked in their boats and committed themselves to the protection of God. Such as were the natural difficulties in the way of navigation in those early times, that it was at best a hazardous undertaking to descend the Holston, Tennessee, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers in such watercraft as there were then able to construct. But what made it doubly hazardous was a belligerent stand with the Cherokee Indians. Now, the Cherokee Indians wanted to protect their country. Remember, they had been beat up by Catholicism. They didn't trust Americans. They didn't trust these Bible-waving people. Because to them, the man that held the Bible was a rat. He was a imposter that represented God, an imposter. And they hadn't been introduced to these people yet. Had taken against the immigration through their country. They often availed themselves of the narrows and shoals and sudden turns in the Holston and Tennessee rivers. Now these were my relatives way back yonder. I'm half Cherokee. To attack immigrant boats. Our voyager, being fully aware of that fact, went as well prepared for it as their limited resources would allow them, and kept a constant watch for the approach of their stealthy foe. We who have until lately generally had peace and truth in our days think it strange that our pious forefathers would thus not only peril their own lives, but also the lives of their wives and the little ones, but they had already become inured in the horrors of the dangers of war, this American Revolution, and viewed such adventures very differently from what we do today. These immigrants, for the sake of mutual protection, had agreed to float as near each other as conveniently possible. The foremost boat contained Richard Curtis, Sr., and his immediate family, and his own sons and daughters with their families. The second boat contained two brothers by the name of Daniel and William Ogden, and a man by the name of Perkins, with their families, most of whom were Baptist. We have no record of the names of those in the third boat. They seem to have fallen in with the others for the sake of protection descending the Natchez River. The voyagers in the lost boat and the last boat had in some way contracted smallpox. The voyagers and immigrants in the last boat somehow contracted smallpox. Smallpox was deadly. Mm-hmm. Now, when smallpox went into Indian territory, my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother survived it. When I was a little boy, I was taken up to Kern General Hospital in Bakersfield, California, and I had a smallpox vaccination, and it hardly affected me at all. I still had the antibodies of smallpox in my body from my grandfather and grandmother. Mm-hmm. They passed it down. Now, smallpox killed many Indians. To prevent the contagion from spreading to their other boats, they were required to float a few hundred yards in the rear and to occupy a different landing at nighttime. In other words, they had to camp separately and float separately, several hundred yards apart. After floating unmolested for several days, the hostile savages espied the boat somewhere near the mouth of the Cinch River and fixed on it a short bend in the Tennessee River near the northwestern corner of Georgia as the place of attack. Having to float near the shore to keep in the channel, the foremost boat was violently assaulted by lurking Cherokees, all hands on board, a vigorous and well-directed defense. That her husband might be, and all hands on board commenced a vigorous and well-directed defense, that her husband might be released to use his rifle on the assailant's car, or while she held up a thick poplar stool between him and the bullets. It was well she did, for it was pierced by one of the Indians' leaden missiles. She was guarding her husband with a heavy chair. After the danger was all over, Mrs. Jones laughingly remarked, "The guns were weak, as they did not make a deep impression in their stool." Another lady, heroically, aren't these real women? Aren't these pioneer women? Another lady heroically took the steering oar from her husband, that he might ply his rifle on the foe, and with unfaltering courage guided the boat until disabled by a wound in her back. Hannah Courtney was grazed in the head by a ball, and Jonathan Curtis was slightly wounded on the wrist. So far as the writer knows, No life was lost. While the attention of the assailants was directed to the first boat, the second boat floated by unharmed. The excited, bloodthirsty savages now directed their whole force to capture the third and the last boat. They were mad. And as it was passing through the narrows, they boarded it with full force and massacred everyone on board except one lady, whom they retained as a captive for about 3 years until by treaty she was restored to her friends. But this was dearly bought victory to the Cherokees, for either from the captured lady or the clothing and other articles taken from the boat they contracted smallpox, which passed through their villages like destroying angel, until multitudes of them died. When suffering from the raging fever and thirst occasioned by the terrible epidemic, they sought relief by lying in the waters of the Tennessee River, which only made it more fatal. Their descendants have to this day a traditional horror of that terrible pestilence. It was possible from the slow and unwielding movements of their flatboats that those who had escaped to round to and land enough to afford the captured boat any assistance at all, even if they had not been so outnumbered as to render their attempt worse than fruitless. So what with gratitude of God for their deliverance and the sadness for their languishing dead foe and their lost fellow voyagers, they pursued their own dangerous way until they landed safely at the mouth of Coles Creek, about 20 miles above Natchez by land. They settled some 10 miles from the river. For several years they endured many hardships, deprivation, and incident to a new country, which was but poorly supplied with the necessities of life that they had been used to. They were like people of sound morals. Richard Curtis Jr. was an instructor in religion. It was said that there was not a cabin in a community in which the Bible was not read, and from which prayers did not ascend to God. Firm in their convictions, they neither prescribed nor prescribed creeds. The idea of religious liberty had taken deep root in the thoughts of this people. This community is called the Salem Baptist Church, but it was constituted not only without presbytery or ministers, but without presence of a single ordained minister. They simply agreed to meet together, statedly, and to worship God according to His Word, and to exercise good discipline over one another, and they called Elder Curtis to preach to them, whose labors were greatly blessed, and eventually this course was a matter of necessity for them. It seemed that the Lord owned and blessed their efforts, and in process, time of sinners were converted to God and professed hope in the Savior and desired baptism by immersion. This brought up in the minds of those pioneer workmen in the Lord's vineyard a very interesting question for solution. Who could administer the ordinance of baptism according to the faith and order of the church, the Baptist church? They needed another church. They needed an ordained minister from some church to administer baptism. Curtis was only a licensed minister and was not authorized according to the polity of Baptist churches to administer baptism. And yet there were persons declaring and desiring the ordinance who exhibited the unusual evidences of conversion. The matter was postponed until by letter they could consult the parent church in Carolina. They were only a mission. They didn't have a church status yet. When we started this church here, discovered the Word Missionary Baptist Church, we had a church, New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, that basically recognized my ordination and this church as a body of believers here. So it was ordained by a church, out of a church, and it was even licensed by the state of Nevada as a 501c3, as an organized church, even though that doesn't matter according to the Bible. The church in the state, on receiving this interesting communication from the Natchez country, took the matter under consideration and returned to answer. that there was no law against necessity, and under the present stress of circumstances, the members ought to assemble and formally appoint one of their number by election to baptize the converts. This is now it's going to become a church. And the church has the power to ordain, and the church has the power to baptize, and the church has the power to administer the Lord's Supper. The church. This advice was acted upon by Richard Curtis and baptized the converts. Thus the first church in Mississippi was organized without presbytery or ordained ministers, but by the auspices of a mother church. From this period in 1793, Bond informs us that little is known about the church, only that it continued to exist and increase in numbers. Other immigrants had come in, among them were some Baptists. At this time is found the name of William Cheney, an ordained deacon among them from South Carolina, and also Bailey Cheney, who was a preacher but not ordained, also a man by the name of Harrigale, Barton Hannon, and William Owen, all of whom it appears preached, but none of them were ordained as far as can be learned. But the church could ordain them. And it's not known whether they began preaching here or came here as licensed preachers to avoid the detection of the Spanish Catholics. On at least one occasion, baptism was administered by torchlight. About this time, there was an occurrence which greatly incensed the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. Stephen D'Alvo renounced the Catholics and united with the Baptists. The opposition of the Catholics broke into a blaze of persecution, and the Baptists were peremptorily ordered to desist from their heretical psalm singing, praying, and preaching in public, or they would be subject to Sunday pains and penalties. This coercive act was followed by another in 1795 through Don Manuel Callosa de Lemos, the Spanish commandant of Natchez, the tenor of which was that if 9 persons were found worshiping together, except according to the forms of the Roman Catholic Church, they should suffer imprisonment. It was at this time that the Spanish governor wrote the explanatory letter to Mr. Curtis demanding that he should desist from what was considered violative to the laws of the province and against the peace and safety of the country. To this letter, Curtis replied with bluntness and informed him that he intended to do his duty. The immediate arrest of Curtis was now ordered. And on April 6, 1795, he stood prisoner before Governor Calloso. He was given to understand that if he did not desist from preaching publicly, he would be sent to Hammerlin, D'Alvo, and others to the mines of Mexico. Money, 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 mines, gold, silver. And he would be worked to death there until he died. For 2 or 3 months only, night meetings were held. About this time, Curtis married a couple, and this former inflamed the authorities. He presided over a marriage. He didn't have a license to give them. They just simply wrote their names in the Bible. And then he presided over this marriage. The officers of the provincial government, says Jones, instigated by the priesthood, made diligent inquiry as to the time and the placing of the holding of their meetings and exhortation and prayer and Christian intercourse, and devised plans for the capture of Messrs. Richard Curtis and William Hammerlin and Stephen D'Alvo. Orders for their arrest were secretly issued on or just previous to the 23rd of August, 1795, and the 23rd of August was a quiet Sabbath. Now, they're calling Sunday the Sabbath, which isn't the Sabbath. With all its holy association inviting the devout worshippers to assemble at a house of prayer. It was the private residence of one of their number, and in what was then and still is known as Stampley Settlement on the South Fork of Coles Creek. The pickets had been promptly posted on all roads, and little persecuted fraternity of Baptists were, in subdued tones, conducting their worship when the sentinel on the Natchez Road came in hurriedly and announced the appearance of 5 religious exercises and closed immediately. And Mr. Curtis and Hamlin and D'Alvo hastened to the neighboring thicket to conceal themselves. Knowing that they were particularly obnoxious to the hierarchy of Natchez, the others advised themselves with apparent carelessness about the house and yard, and when unwelcome guests rode in upon the characteristic self-importance, inquired, what are you all doing here?" They replied, "We are not harming anybody. We always suspend our secular avocations on the Sabbath and either rest at home or spend our time in such intercourse with each other as suits us. We wish to see Dick Curtis, Bill Hamlin, and Steve D'Alvo, either one or all of them. Where are we to find them this morning?" And they all did this under papal intolerance, to which an evasive answer was given, such as, "We don't know exactly, somewhere around the neighborhood, we suppose." The officer then announced that he had come with orders from Governor Gayoso to arrest these 3 rebels, preparatory to their being sent to the mines to work the remainder of their lives. If any man should be found siding or aiding or abetting them, either concealment or escape, he should suffer the same penalty, work till you die in the mines, just like in Mount Potosi. It therefore became necessity for the security of these men that she should leave the country. They were provided with horses, but no man must be found aiding or abetting them in their escape. Who will take the supplies to their place of concealment on Bayou Pierre? And problem was solved by a daring young woman in the neighborhood of Clos Holt. "If the men in the neighborhood," said she, "are afraid and faint-hearted that none of them can be prevailed upon to take Dick Curtis and his companions to exile, their promised supplies in order to secure their escape from the clutches of these gospel-hating Catholics, if they will furnish me with a good horse, surmounted with a man's saddle, I will go in spite of the Spaniards, and they can catch me if they can." Oh, that's a good woman, isn't it? That's like Marilyn. Yeah. Sharon. All things being ready, she made her appearance, dressed in a man's clothes. She mounted her horse and boldly dashed off. In due process of time, Curtis and his companions reached the great Pedy in South Carolina, where they remained for 2 years and a half. In the meantime, Curtis was an active and acceptable preacher and was ordained to the gospel ministry by elders Benjamin Horsley and Matthew Collins, and the Natchez County had a meantime passed under the control of Georgia, not Spain, and was reorganized in the United States territory. While this much desired event was verging to maturity, the Baptist community in Natchez were not idle and spectators. They resumed their meetings and for public worship. They had written to the long banished brethren in South Carolina to return home, and expectation was on tiptoe and hailed the revival. I wanted to look and see how much time we had. Previews of coming attractions. We'll stop right there. Right there as the woman is about to jump off the cliff or whatever, you know, the old shows on Saturday matinee. Previews of coming attractions for next week. For the next class, we'll get the rest of the story. Return of Curtis and his companions was most affecting, and they were waiting with bated breath for the return of their ministers of gospel. Our Father, we send this message out for your honor and glory. Thank you for what we've discovered in your word. Thank you for the people that worship you so long ago, that we may have the gospel and the Bibles we have today. Please forgive us where we fail you. Help us to hold tight to the principles that they stood and died for and suffered for. In Jesus' name we